Today's course is going to be on crawl spaces and how they relate to termite and pest control. This course is prepared and narrated by Sean Reeves, Associate Certified Entomologist. After taking today's course, you will be able to understand the use of wood as a construction material, explain why crawl spaces are important in pest control, detail how to perform a crawl space inspection, show common issues relating to pest control found in crawl spaces, discuss moisture issues found in crawl spaces, and present techniques that help solve moisture and ventilation issues in crawl spaces. I wanted to get everyone a little introduction about today's training. In this training, you will learn the steps to inspecting and remediating issues in crawl spaces. Crawl spaces are very important in termite and pest control. You must understand how crawl spaces relate to pest issues and how to help solve these as part of a complete pest control service plan. And I'm mentioning this because crawl spaces can be one of the most overlooked areas in the home. So make sure each time you have a crawl space home, you're doing a good inspection and drawing up a treatment plan. And in this course, we're going to talk about the steps to doing that. Let's take a look at section 1 in our course, looking at wood as a construction material. Let's begin by talking about wood as a construction material. Tree species can be divided into hardwoods and softwoods. Softwoods are coniferous and have needle-like leaves. Common softwoods are pine, hemlock, cedar, and redwood. The structural members of residential homes are usually made out of softwoods. Hardwoods are deciduous and typically have broad leaves. Hardwoods shed all their leaves at once. Hardwoods are commonly used on floors, cabinets, and furniture. So many of you would probably understand when we talk about softwoods, typically you're going to find things like pine and studded walls of homes and inside any of the build-outs inside. So this is a really common softwood, and this is part of the reason why we have so many issues related to home construction and especially in crawl spaces, because these are very soft woods. Your hardwoods, again, are going to be more furniture, more floors, cabinets, things like that. So keeping in mind, one of the reasons why we're talking about wood as a construction material, because it does play a big role in why crawl spaces are such a big issue in termite and pest control. Let's take a look at the properties of wood. At first sight, wood appears to be a solid material. Wood is made up of many tiny tubes that actually make it porous. Wood is always trying to reach equilibrium with the moisture in the air. Wood is either going to give off or absorb moisture until that equilibrium is reached. Wood in properly constructed homes seldom reaches above 16 to 18%. Wood above 30% is especially in the danger zone. So basically what we're talking about in this slide is the fact that wood is not as solid as it appears to be. It actually is very porous and it absorbs moisture. So you have to keep in mind, if you have wood in a moist area, it's going to absorb moisture because it's going to try to reach that equilibrium with the moisture in the air of where it's at. So it's either going to give off moisture or absorb moisture based on the humidity in the area. I always tell people that wood in properly constructed homes, it's seldom going to reach above that 16 to 18%, which is good. Once again, talking about crawl spaces, this is an area where moisture is always an issue. Condensation is always going to be rising up from the soil. There can be moist air carried in from the vents outside. Some homes don't have vapor barriers, and we're going to talk more about that as we go. But want you to know that wood above 30% is especially in the danger zone. One of the things about that is that would usually be a plumbing leak or something like that that would cause that. It could get nearly that high if you looked at like a lot of standing water in a crawl space and that condensation rising, but for the most part you won't see wood above that 30%. But I just wanted you to know that wood is not as solid as it appears, and you do need to make sure that it stays in that 16 to 18% range to be out of the danger zone. Getting back to actually what the course is about today, we need to talk more about wood in crawl spaces. As many of you know, the use of wood on floor joists and subfloors is one of the main reasons crawl spaces are very important in termite and pest control. Most commonly, the softwood pine is used in home construction due to its low price point. So once again, we're talking about why pine is used. Actually, it has a very low price point, and that's the reason why a lot of people use it. I'm sure people would love to use things like oak, but the problem is the price point's too high, and that's why that's used more in furniture. So keep in mind this soft wood of pine is very easily attacked, whether it's termites, whether it's moisture issues. It just doesn't have that denseness and that hardness of an actual hardwood. In section 2, we're going to talk about inspections. Performing a crawl space inspection. Remember, performing a crawl space inspection is a complex undertaking. One of the first obstacles you may face is the clearance from the floor joist to the soil grade. As you can imagine, instances where you have less than 18 inches can make crawling these areas virtually impossible. Keep in mind the fact that it's worth all the effort to crawl the tight spaces because you will find issues that need to be resolved. And I tell people this all the time, it's very important to get in these crawl spaces because if you don't, you're not really taking care of your customer. The fact of the matter is that they can be very tight. I've even had instances where we had to dig our way through a crawl space, move soil and different things. But that's where you're going to find the major problems, especially as we're going to talk later about like moisture issues. The closer the floor joists are to the soil, the more problems there can be. So I do understand if it's less than 18 inches, especially, it can be really tough to crawl. But you really want to get underneath there. It's going to be good for your business, good for the customer, and everybody's going to win.
So what type of tools would you need when doing an inspection? You know, if you ask different people, you're going to get a wide variety of answers to this question. I would definitely tell you this, just looking on our screen, one of the things that I like are tweezers and probe tools. Definitely like brushes. Flashlights are imperative. You really can't do an inspection at all without a flashlight. Black lights can be good to show things like urine, things like that. A good inspection mirror as well, because with a good inspection mirror that's flexible, you can look up underneath things and behind things a whole lot easier. Now obviously you could use things like an aspirator, a white rubber mallet. Specimen vials can be good just to collect any insects you may find. Knee pads are a good idea because they protect you when you're crawling in crawl spaces and areas like that. Screwdrivers and a magnifying glass. And of course a Termatrac eye tracker we really like because there's a lot of functions that can help you do a great inspection. Inspection techniques and equipment. As we mentioned before, good light is essential. The inspector should carry an extra flashlight to prevent unnecessary delays during inspections. A heavy jackknife, awl, or dental tools for probing into the wood is also a necessity. A thick piece of spring-sealed or a hacksaw blade is needed for testing earth-filled porches. A screwdriver, measuring tape or wheel, and a small hammer should be included with your equipment. A light, strong ladder is essential. Coveralls, a stocking cap, gloves and knee pads, chalk, respirator, telescoping mirror, hand microscope, magnifying glass, and an eye tracker make up the balance of the essential equipment. Some inspectors carry cameras or use their phone to photograph special conditions. A legal-sized clipboard equipped with inspection tags, ruler, and pencil is handy to sketch a diagram of the structure and make notes of findings.
So the way to get started on the inspection is to enter the crawl space and inspect in a clockwise format. You can see the little diagram we've drawn here where you actually see the crawl entry door. You're going to go in and you can see yellow marks on this diagram to where we're actually showing where you shine the flashlight to all the walls and you take a look at everything. Always do it in a clockwise format to make sure you shine all walls. Now I do understand there can almost be like separate rooms and things inside of a crawl space. It's almost kind of interesting how you can go through a little opening and end up in another room. But keep in mind, if you work in a clockwise format, even if you're in a main crawl space that opens up to a smaller one, you just go into the smaller one, do the clockwise format, come out, and then pick up right where you left off in the main crawl space. But this is a way to make sure you don't miss anything. Inside a crawl space, there's just so many different things that can be going on. You really need to get a full idea of what you can see while you're under there. So go in, do the clockwise format inspection, but keep in mind you're also going to need to write things down when you get out. So you really either got to have like a notebook in your pocket, maybe a little notepad, or have a good memory of the things you see, because once you come out of that crawl space, there's going to be a lot to figure out in your mind when you're drawing a diagram and things like that. And you really want to make sure you note everything. And again, take photos as you go, because this will help you doing the inspection and help you draw the diagram at the end. One of the biggest things you're going to run into in a crawl space is termite activity. Once again, you're going to need to make sure you're shining all walls to look for things like this. You also need to look at the block piers in a crawl space to make sure there's not any activity around those. So as you can see in the photo here, there's some nice big termite tubes that have built up the outside wall of a crawl space here. Piers is the same way. I mean, the block piers that the crawl space sits on, you're going to find activity around those too, especially when it comes to termites. So you need to make sure you shine all these areas. Once again, you're going to need to be looking for things like the tubes. You're going to need to be looking for moisture. Obviously, as you go, you're going to see more and more things. Like in this particular crawl space, the vapor barrier was really broken down. So there's just a laundry list of issues you can come across, but make sure, again, you're shining all the walls, the piers, and make sure you're keeping a mental note or a notepad to write down your inspection findings when you're done. The photo on this screen is a picture of termite tubes found in a crawl space in Florida. One of the things I want you to be aware of is the fact that drywood termites can also infest crawl spaces. This is going to be most common in the Gulf coastal states to the Carolinas, even places like New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So if you're in the Midwest, the Northeast, the Upper Plains, you're definitely not going to have a problem with this. But it is something to note that there can be drywood termites, and you're going to be looking for things like frass and their fecal pellets in the crawl spaces.
The eye tracker made by Termatrac can aid us in identifying if the termites are active or if it's old evidence.
In this slide, we're looking at blown-on insulation on crawl space walls. This is another issue I've run across where companies will actually blow cellulose insulation on the crawl space walls, make it stick, and then you can't do an inspection. On this particular home, we actually scraped a gap at the bottom of the walls, and we found a subterranean termite tube. So once again, anything that restricts your inspections, you're going to have to figure out. You may want to ask customers permission like we did on this one, but we told them we really can't do an inspection without doing this, and the whole wall shouldn't have been covered. So once again, blown on insulation like this is a big problem and needs to be removed enough that you can do an inspection. Another interesting thing you're going to come across in crawl spaces is fungi and microbial growth. There's a lot that could be said about these things, and each state has a different idea of how they look at this as far as treatments, as far as what you need to write down on inspections. But I did want to let you know that fungi are common in crawl space inspections. This is especially true in more humid areas in the eastern U.S. and along the Gulf Coast and even in the Pacific Northwest. So if you're in a drier area, say like West Texas or Arizona, California, Nevada, you may not see as much of this because the relative humidity is so much lower. In this photo here, these are fungal spores of a crawl space we observed in the state of Tennessee. But I just wanted everybody to know, really look at the floor joists, look at areas that might have fungi like this. You can even take your finger and smear across them and see if those fungal spores smear, then you're definitely going to know they're active, whereas they could be dead if they don't smear. But again, if you're seeing them, it's better to err on the side that they are active and is something you need to look at performing treatment for. In this slide, I just wanted you to see what some drywood termite evidence looks like. As you look at the photo on the left, you can see where the joists have drywood termite damage with the clean galleries and pellets down below. So the drywood termites definitely aren't leaving any soil in their galleries. They're real clean, and the pellets are dropping below. We're not going to talk a ton about that. We have some other courses on drywood termites if you're interested later. On the right, you're going to see evidence of drywood termite swarm wings. So these are just actual wings from a swarm. So again, these are definitely some things you can come across in crawl spaces in certain parts of the country. On this slide, you're just seeing a couple more examples of fungi. You can just see they're just little plant-like growth that grow on the wood. So whenever you see this, it almost looks like specks, but they're a little bit taller. You're definitely going to know this is fungi you're seeing. Another thing you need to think about when you're doing your inspection is if the fungi is active or not. As you can see in the photo here, you would actually take your finger with your gloves on, rub across the fungi and see if it smears. If it smears, it's definitely active. This is going to help you out when you think about how to remediate problems in the crawl space. If you're dealing with an active fungus, it's definitely different than if you're dealing with one that's dried up. So keep in mind you always want to do the smear test to see if the fungi is active or not. I wanted to talk to you a little more about surface molds and sap-stained fungi. Surface molds discolor the surface of the wood. Surface molds do not weaken the wood, which is very important to know. Surface molds are usually green, black, and orange or powdery in appearance. Concerns with these are respiratory and not structural, and that's a big deal because a lot of people are concerned about microbial growth and how does it affect the structural members of the home. These spore or seeds of surface molds grow quickly on moist wood. Large quantities indicate excessive moisture. Control involves reducing or eliminating the source of moisture. So I want everybody to know again, surface molds can come in multiple colors. I don't really have a photo necessarily of the orange ones. If you've ever seen the orange powder surface molds, they're very interesting. They are a bright orange color. It's kind of impressive what they look like. But I want everybody to know that these are more of a respiratory issue. At the same point in time, most people, if you showed them photos of these, wouldn't be happy that's going on in the crawl space of their home. So you need to just keep in mind as you're thinking about treatment plans, how you can solve these. A lot of the control it basically involves reducing or eliminating the source of moisture, but there's also other things you can do. And if you're seeing large quantities of these, there's definitely a major moisture issue. So you need to be thinking to yourself, what can I do to reduce that moisture? And as we go through the next few slides, we'll talk about some things that you can do to help that problem. In this slide, you're going to see some surface fungi. As you can see on this surface fungi, it's actually a yellowish orange color mixed in with some greens, but it's a real powdery looking fungi. This is something I wanted everybody to see because this is something you will run across in crawl spaces. Typically ones that have a pretty good moisture content, but it's kind of impressive to see. It can even be like a really, really bright orange, kind of like an orange, the fruit itself, but here it was a little bit discolored, but the point is that you will come across things like this in crawl spaces. We're going to look at wood decay fungi. This is a little bit different because a wood decaying fungus cannot make or capture its own food. It actually feeds off materials such as wood. And I want to stop there because you can figure out in your mind that if it's feeding off the wood, then we've got some major issues that can happen. Obviously, with the name like wood decay fungi, you already know that it's definitely doing some damage to the wood and the structure itself. The wood decay fungi secrete enzymes that break down wood components into sugars. The body of the fungus is made up of long thread-like strands. Strands combine into mats that produce reproductive structures. Severe wood decay can occur in wood with greater than 20% moisture. These are going to break down and compromise the integrity of the wood. So once again, people are definitely concerned about like the respiratory issues we talked about in the last slide, but they're going to be even more concerned when you're breaking down the structural integrity of their wood. So you really need to do a good inspection when it's coming to something like this because structural issues are going to be a big deal. My advice is when it comes to structural issues, I wouldn't stay too much on that with people because most of us are not structural engineers and we really need to think about what we say to people. And if we do think there's a major structural issue, we might suggest that they hire a structural engineer. But I do want you knowing that with severe wood decay, it's usually going to be greater than 20% moisture. So as you're going through crawl spaces, and we're going to even talk about moisture meters, the amount of moisture and percentage is going to be a big deal on telling you kind of what you're running across and what you can do about it. On this screen, you can see photos of brown rot. If you look especially at the photo on the left, you'll see that brown rot can crack perpendicular to the grain. So it actually cracks cross grain on the wood itself.
Fungi is a living organism that does not require sunlight to grow. Wood decay fungi generally grows in wood with a moisture content above 20%. Wood with a 30% moisture content is especially unacceptable. Using the eye tracker to detect moisture. When we see an area of interest where there might be some moisture issues, we put the moisture sensor on that area and we get to see what type of moisture is in that wood. The moisture sensor measures relative and direct humidity, so it gives you two ways to measure what's going on in that area, and we see this as a great value.
Another issue you want to be looking for in your crawl space inspection is going to be sagging insulation. You're always going to want to note sagging insulation on your reports. I can tell you firsthand this is a great way to articulate to your client the depth of the moisture issue in the crawl space. So imagine if somebody came out of your crawl space and showed you a photo like this. You would definitely understand that there must be condensation or something rising up to your floor joist and causing your insulation to sag down. So as that moisture lifts, that condensation, it's making that insulation really heavy and making it sag down. So again, this is something you need to note, because as you're looking at crawl spaces and debris, this is something you definitely can't leave on the floor. You wouldn't be able to do any work in the future with all that insulation on the floor. This is another opportunity for you to help your client in something that is going to be a major issue in the future and already is now. I wanted to quickly drop in this slide of a humidity map of the U.S. So as you can see in this slide, you're going to have definitely more humid areas in the southeast, all the way up through the northeast, the Great Lakes, and the upper Midwest. As you go out west into the desert, you're going to have states like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada that have a very low relative humidity. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about your inspections, what the humidity is, and how this is going to affect the types of insects you would come across in your area, and including moisture issues in crawl spaces. Let's take a look at wood to ground contact. Wood to ground contact is another important issue to note in a crawl space inspection. Anytime wood touches the ground, it is absorbing moisture from the soil. Termites can easily attack this wood since they can build the tubes right up the sides while having a consistent food source along the way. So many of you have probably seen this where you got some wood to soil contact, and many times, depending on where you're at in the country, you're going to see termites kind of working their way up the wood through the tube. So keep in mind, wood to ground contact is something that you're going to want to note on your inspection sheet, but it's also something that has to be taken care of. It's definitely going to do nothing good in the future, whether it's termites, whether it's wood rot. Everything is going to be able to attack that wood because its proximity to the ground touching there and moisture coming up it. One of the other things you need to note when you're doing your inspection is the condition of the vapor barrier. That's why we titled this slide, Is There an Adequate Vapor Barrier? Now obviously when you're doing your inspections, you're going to look for things like a bunching up of the barrier itself. Maybe it's been pulled back in areas. It can have leaves on it, it can have soil, it can have debris. I mean, there's just 50 different things that can be wrong with a vapor barrier. But you definitely need to note the condition on this, because a good vapor barrier is imperative to keeping the moisture down and the condensation from rising up to the floor joist. As we've been mentioning, areas of the country can be more prone to this in the Gulf coastal states, the Northeast, the Midwest. But anywhere you're at in the country, make sure your vapor barrier is good. Make sure you note this on your graph, and make sure it's something you look at when you're looking at remediating issues in the crawl space. In this slide, I wanted to show you real quickly a couple photos of vapor barriers. The one on the left is definitely the bad vapor barrier I showed you in the last slide. The one on the right is a good vapor barrier. This one just happens to be in white. A lot of people will use black. As long as it's 6 mil or bigger, that's fine. And in this one, we actually ran it up the piers a little bit and capped it off with some tape. But I wanted you to kind of see the difference real quick of what a good vapor barrier looks like as opposed to a bad one. Moving further along on our inspection, we need to look for things like debris in the crawl space. Debris in a crawl space is obviously another conducive condition. Debris often has cellulose material in it, such as wood. The debris must be marked as part of your inspection on the graph, just like everything else we've talked about. Debris always needs to be removed later. So as you can even see in this photo here, there's definitely things like wood and debris under crawl spaces usually. Any of that is going to be an absolute buffet for termites. So this is an extreme example here of wood in a crawl space, but I can tell you people have things like old boxes, stored items with paper in them. Those are going to be major things to take care of to get rid of or prevent termites in a crawl space. Plus, you need to be able to get around under there, and you also need to be able to lay a vapor barrier or at least check the barrier underneath debris to see if it's still good. So definitely part of your plan in the inspection is to write this stuff down and then make a plan later to remove debris in crawl space. I got to tell you, there's so many things we can look at on inspections of crawl spaces that we could probably be here all day and not list them all. But I did want to mention that now that we've done all this work on the inspection and everything else, make sure you're documenting it well. So we mentioned before that each one of these steps you're finding wrong, you're going to need to document on a graph. For the sake of time in this course, we're not going to go over the whole graphing process, but just make sure you're putting all your findings, again, of termites, general insects, moisture, debris, ventilation issues, and other conducive conditions that are noted. These are the things you're going to need later because you can't really build a good treatment plan without having good documentation of what you found. Then it's much easier to make solutions to solve the problems you have. That takes us to Section 3, developing treatment plans for ventilation and moisture issues. As we look at solving ventilation issues, I want to refer to something called International Building Code. I was actually introduced to International Building Code when I got my termite license in Georgia. I hadn't really previously looked at this, but I found some really good ideas in there. One of the things they talk about in International Building Code is ventilation area for crawl spaces with open earth floors. So keep in mind that this is going to be your standard crawl space with the open earth. The net area of ventilation openings for the crawl space with uncovered earth floors shall not be less than 1 square foot for each 150 square feet of crawl space area. So there's going to be some great math to look at here, but just keep in mind that there is an international building code and it does say that we should have at least 1 square foot of ventilation for each 150 square feet of crawl space area. I want to talk a little bit more about calculating the vents needed for a crawl space. So upon calculating the total square footage of a crawl space, you're going to take that number and divide it by 150. This is going to give you the total number of vents required. For instance, a 1,500 square foot crawl space would be 1,500 divided by 150. That would equal 10 total vents needed. So the last calculation is assuming that each vent is 1 square foot each. Keep in mind, you need to know the actual square footage of the vents you put in. But to keep it simple here, I thought we would just make them 1 square foot each. So keep in mind, it's a real simple calculation. You always need to know the square footage of the crawl space, and you're always going to divide that by 150 to get the minimum number of vents you need to have in that crawl space. According to various sources, the floor of a crawl space should have a vapor barrier covering 80 to 90% of the floor space. The goal of the vapor barrier coverage is to stop the condensation from rising up to the floor joist from the soil. The condensation can obviously lead to things like fungal growth and or wood rot.
Here's a short list of materials you may need when laying a vapor barrier or performing a crawl space encapsulation service.
But There's reasons why this is not that way, and especially with 80 to 90% coverage, what you do is you leave a gap from the edges of like the block walls going a little bit into the soil, because the vapor barrier needs to breathe. So those vents on the outer perimeter need to be able to lift some of that moisture out that comes from underneath the vapor barrier, and it needs to be carried outside. So you really don't want to have 100% vapor barrier coverage, because then every little spot that's not sealed perfectly, that condensation is going to rise straight. So what you're going to do is when you roll out a section of the vapor barrier, you're going to take these and hammer them down so that the barrier doesn't move when you crawl across it or walk across it doing other layers. You need things like scissors. Scissors will cut right through a vapor barrier, so it's really nice. You can actually take the scissors and kind of glide right through it, so you don't even have to really squeeze the scissors. Just open them and glide through. It'll cut it really nicely. You need things like seaming tape. So obviously you're going to have multiple sections of the vapor barrier, and you're going to need to seam it together. So I like a 6-inch wide seaming tape. I typically do all my vapor barriers and encapsulations in white, so I'll use a white like seaming tape that's made specifically for vapor barriers. Obviously a tape measure you're going to need. You need to kind of go under, measure like from the outside walls to the first set of piers, and then figure out how wide you need your strip of the vapor barrier to be, and then figure out the length you want, because you're going to obviously want to cut sections at a time. You're definitely not going to go in a 2,000 square foot crawl space, unroll a whole vapor barrier and then make it all fit. You really need to cut it in sections, and you need to seam it together after you anchor it down. So these are some tools you can think about. Obviously, there may be other things you'll use, but this would kind of be a minimum list of tools. I wanted to let you guys know with the landscape or vapor barrier anchors, as I'm going to call them now, basically they're real simple. I like the ones with the 2 prongs and the caps like you see here. So we've actually got a nice white cap on this one. Really all you're going to need is a hammer to hammer these down and just make them flat with the ground. So the 2 prongs are going to hammer into the soil, and then you're going to have a nice flat cap right on top of your vapor barrier. One thing you can do as well is you can overlap the next seam, so you really won't even have to deal with that cap underneath. Obviously there's going to be a row of caps on top, but at least it'll lessen the number of caps, if you will, that you're going to see as you look at the vapor barrier itself. As you can see in the attached photos, I wanted to give you an idea of what the double-sided and the seaming tape looks like. So the double-sided tape's black, and you just peel it off from one side, and then it's going to have stickiness on both sides of the tape. So you're actually going to take it, you're going to attach it to a crawl space wall or a pier, whatever you're trying to attach a vapor barrier to. You're going to stick one side on there, then you're going to pull the second side of the tape to where it's still sticky without touching it, and then you're going to put your vapor barrier against it. You can also see the 6-inch wide white seaming tape here. That's really good for everywhere on the floor. When you cut your vapor barrier, you anchor it down, you're going to have seams, and you need to run this tape down every seam. Once again, what I'm showing you is in white, because I really like white for vapor barriers or crawl space encapsulations. That's up to you if you want to use black or another color. But at least this gives you an idea of what those materials look like and how you're going to use them. Another great solution to solving moisture issues in a crawl space is encapsulating the crawl space. When using this method, you will be adding the vapor barrier to the floor and running it up the walls and the piers. I'm going to tell you this is a great way to seal out moisture. You need to make sure to either add a vent to the main trunk of the ductwork or add a crawl space dehumidifier as part of this. So basically, this is the best solution for sealing up a crawl space. At this point, you're really not letting the moisture in the crawl space at all. Keep in mind that can become like a pressure cooker underneath there though. If you seal it all up and there's nothing moving the air around or kind of taking the moisture out, you could have some major problems, and the moisture can actually be worse. So keep in mind something as simple as having an extra vent cut in the main trunk of the ductwork helps. What that does is the inside of the house obviously has the thermostat. That makes the crawl space temperature kind of consistent with the inside of the house, or at least closer. So that definitely helps keep the humidity level down. And obviously a crawl space dehumidifier is not a bad idea. That's going to draw the moisture out of the air. One thing you need to do though, you need to have like a positive drain put in like a low spot in the crawl space where that moisture can kind of drain from that dehumidifier. It's definitely not something you want to go down yourself and have to worry about or dump water out of. But just keep in mind, you're going to need something moving air around. You're going to need something to dehumidify. Never ever close up a crawl space this way. But I'm going to tell you, as far as solving moisture problems, I've had my best luck when encapsulating the crawl space and not allowing the moisture to get in the first place. Alright, so here's some photos of actual crawl space encapsulation. This is really nice. This is done in a 12 mil white vapor barrier. I really like the 12 mil and I like the white. A lot of people call these like clean spaces, different things like that. But it's just very important to make it look good like you're seeing here. You're not going to get every ruffle out of the plastic itself, but you can see how well this really is seamed up and how well it's really laying out. One thing that I did notice on this job, that there was no gap at the top of the block foundation to do termite inspections in the future. So looking at it from a pest and termite control point of view, you definitely are going to want to leave a 4-inch gap on the block up at the top to make sure that you can do termite inspections in the future. And probably you wouldn't know this by looking, but there's actually double-sided tape on the back of the poly where it's against the walls. So that's how it's being held up. So a lot of times you wouldn't even think about, what's holding it back there, but there is double-sided tape holding it back in that area. One issue you may need to resolve when doing an encapsulation is, will you need to add foam board insulation to the exterior walls, or is it currently there? Let's say that it was currently there. One of the things you may need to do is you may need to cut that gap with like a 1 block path there to be able to do termite inspections, as you see here. Another thing you may look at is, do we need to do insulation? As you can imagine, under floor joist insulation has a lot of problems. It gets wet, it gets moldy, it falls down. Foam board insulation is a great idea. Just keep in mind you have to have your gap to do termite inspections. What you're seeing here is a 2-inch foam board insulation that we anchored with 22 caliber nail guns with washers on it. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I did want to mention it because it's definitely a big part of crawl space inspections and especially encapsulations. As I earlier mentioned, you want to be thinking about an inspection gap at the top of any encapsulation to be able to inspect for termites. As you can see in the photo here, we have a nice little inspection gap at the top where you can actually look and see if there's termite activity. Keep in mind, if termites build their way up and there's a vapor barrier all the way to the top of the block foundation, they're going to work their way right up in there and they're going to get into the sill plate and the floor joist without you ever knowing. So this inspection gap is really important to be able to do future inspections. Another method for controlling like sources of fungi would be the use of borates. Products like Timbor and Boracare are a pretty common option. I'm sure many of you have probably seen or heard of this if you've been involved in crawl space work at all. These are nice products. I mean, they're basically a sodium salt base. They work pretty well. They have a long residual. Definitely make sure you read the label when using these types of products because there are a lot of factors to keep in mind. You're going to be spraying a product like this. It's going to have some overspray. So always follow the label. But I just kind of wanted to introduce you to these types of products, these borates, because they do work really well in crawl spaces, especially on things like the wood down there. As part of this training, we wanted to go over the Boracare label. As you can see in the photo here, this is just kind of showing a Boracare label itself. But I kind of want to go over it a little bit on the next few slides because I feel like this is a product that's commonly used in crawl spaces. But a lot of people also have trouble deciphering and understanding the label. So in the next few slides, we're going to go over Boracare just a little bit. Looking at the top of the Boracare label, I took some of the verbiage off there, but basically Boracare itself is a termiticide, insecticide, fungicide. It's a concentrate for the prevention and control of things like subterranean termites, Formosan termites, drywood termites, carpenter ants. It's also listed for like wood destroying beetles, fungi, rot, and algae. So that's just some of the things that you can control with Boracare. So guys, anytime we talk about a label, obviously you're going to need to read the label before you applicate with any products. I know I've mentioned that time and time again. I'm just showing you different sections of it just to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that are on the label. So Boracare itself is for use in and around residential, institutional, and commercial structures, including homes, apartments, garages, museums, public and private institutions, schools, hotels, hospitals, kennels, places like stables, farm buildings, trucks, trailers, warehouses, and non-food areas of supermarkets, restaurants, and even food processing plants. So Boracare itself has a pretty broad label. There's a lot of areas you can use it in. I know again we're focusing on crawl spaces, but I can also tell you that in each one of these commercial types of structures, you can have crawl spaces. It's very common for schools to have crawl spaces, and it's kind of nice that a product like this can be used in places like schools. As we look a little bit deeper into the Boracare label, it's important that you know that the active ingredient in this is disodium octaborate tetrahydrate. So that's good to know, right? Because basically it's sodium and borates. So this is actually one of the safer products out there. I don't want to say safe, but I want to let you know that this is not a real toxic, a real strong product. You're always going to make sure you know what the caution words and everything like that are. Like on this label, it says keep out of reach of children with the caution word. So obviously it's not something you want a kid to get into and pour on themselves or anything like that. But with that active ingredient being pretty non-toxic for humans and vertebrates, that really helps out. Otherwise, this product does have an EPA registration number. So again, that's great that this product has been tested and approved by the EPA. Our next section on the Boracare label is going to be some precautionary statements. This is going to have some hazards to humans and domestic animals. So once again, it's fairly non-toxic, but you also got to understand you don't want to get this on your body and you don't want other people to come into contact with it. You're going to need to do things like wear long sleeve shirts, long pants, socks, shoes, and have chemical resistant gloves. Many of you have heard of barrier laminate gloves or butyrol rubber, nitrile. So those are the types of things you're going to want to look at, like neoprene gloves, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, Vitin, or others listed in Category C on an EPA chemical resistance category selection chart. So obviously when you're working in a crawl space, you're actually going to be applying Boracare in a confined space. So as we look at the label as it relates to that, you need to make sure you provide ventilation or an exhaust system or use of a NIOSH approved dust mist filtering respirator. This would be MSHA/NIOSH approval number prefix TC-21C. It needs a pre-filter approved for pesticides. This would be MSHA-NIOSH approval prefix TC23C or a canister approved for pesticides MSHA-NIOSH approval prefix TC14G or a NIOSH approved respirator with any NRP or HE pre-filters recommended. So there's some specific recommendations you need to know for these NIOSH respirators before you applicate with this product. And obviously, as far as providing ventilation or an exhaust system goes, it depends. I mean, there is good ventilation on some crawl spaces, but is it really enough? I would definitely go with the respirator. And of course, you're not really going to put an exhaust system in there. So again, the respirator is going to be your best bet. Let's look at the mixing instructions on a Boracare label. Mixing instructions for Boracare is a concentrate that must be diluted with clean water before use. The use of warm or hot water is not required, but if available, can aid the dilution process. An impeller type of mixer can be used with an electric drill to shorten mixing time. This is a really big deal. I can tell you, if you've ever used Boracare, it's a thick gelatin type of substance. I mean, if it's cold in the wintertime where you're at, it can be really, really tough to get this product to mix. You're going to spend a lot of time. So I just wanted to let you know, just like the label says, that warm or hot water is great. I'm sure most of you won't have something like that on site. So keep in mind, you're probably going to be using regular cool water, or obviously even some cooler cold water if it's really cold out. So keep in mind, you're going to need an impeller type of mixer to mix this stuff up. It's basically like a paint mixer you put on a drill. You don't want to try to stir this by hand. It's really, really hard to stir it up by hand and get it where it's not too thick to come out of your sprayer. Okay guys, I just wanted to show an example of a mixing paddle on a drill here. So it's pretty simple. It's got some fan flaps to it. But this is the best way to mix your Boracare. Just get an attachment of the mixing flaps and put it on your drill. And probably you're going to want to do it for at least a couple of minutes. Again, you need to make sure that Boracare really gets mixed up in the bucket before you pour it in your sprayer. I want to talk a little bit more on the label and talk about hand volume pumping systems. So they're going to talk about something a little different here. They're going to talk about mixing the product in the tank itself. I prefer not to do it that way. I actually like mixing it with a paint stirrer and a bucket like we talked about, and then pouring it into the sprayer. But when you do it the way the label talks about, it's going to talk about adding all the dilution water to the tank. So obviously, first things first, add your water to the tank. Then you're going to start the recirculator. So you're going to get that water moving around, and then you're going to slowly add the Boracare concentrate. Once again, this is not my favorite method, but since it's on the label, we're going to say that's definitely a way you can do it. You're going to want to mix it until it's uniform, obviously. You're going to be using either a 1-to-1, 2-to-1, or 3-to-1 ratio of the Boracare, and you're going to make sure you use it within 24 hours of mixing. Now, it does say that 5-to-1 solutions will remain stable up to 30 days. I definitely wouldn't suggest leaving this product in a tank for 30 days. This product likes to crystallize. I found that out. Even when it talks about cleaning and or flushing the equipment in lines with water after each use, that's hugely important. There's no worse product to crystallize and gum up your equipment than Boracare. If any of you have ever used it, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So my suggestion is mix exactly what you need to use it, and then make sure you run at least a gallon of water through your equipment to kind of knock that Boracare out. Because once it crystallizes in your lines, it's very hard to fix your equipment up after that. Obviously, as you can imagine, as with any type of pest control, you're going to need a good treatment rig for the Boracare. In this photo, I'm showing you a pretty standard rig. There's a lot of different systems you can use. The lower pressure you use, the better, because you don't want the Boracare to be sprayed on and splash off. So keep in mind, calibration and pressure is going to be a really big deal when doing a Boracare treatment. This is similar to like a termite rig here. It's one option for you. It's not my favorite option. So you may want to look at some misting systems for pest control. Maybe they have a thinner hose, and maybe they've got like a lower pressure. That's the types of things you're really going to want. Now, keeping in mind that Boracare does have that gelatin substance in it, so it's sticky. So the good thing is, no matter what you're using, you can definitely get it to stick to the wood, but lower pressure is always going to be better in a Boracare treatment. I want to talk to you about something on the label, which is going to be fungi rot and algae. So Boracare is going to be mixed in 3 different ways, and it really depends on what type of activity you have currently or what you're trying to prevent. So you're going to see ratios on the Boracare label like a 1-to-1, 3-to-1, or 5-to-1. So a 1-to-1 ratio on the Boracare label is 1 gallon of Boracare to 1 gallon of water. A 3-to-1 is going to be 3 gallons of water to 1 gallon of Boracare, and a 5-to-1 is going to be 5 gallons of water to 1 gallon of Boracare. Reading directly from the label, you're going to see for remedial control, you're going to use a 1-to-1 dilution on wood members 4 inches thick or greater. You're going to use a 3-to-1 dilution ratio for wood less than 4 inches thick for active remedial treatment of dry rot. And if we're working on a preventative project, you're going to use a 5-to-1 dilution ratio. May also be used at a 5:1 dilution to control and prevent fungi on wood less than 4 inches thick when mixed with other fungicides. So keep in mind there's some things you need to know. You need to know obviously if what you're trying to treat is active or not, because the ratios for active versus preventative are a lot different on a BoraCare label. I mention this because a lot of people struggle with the BoraCare label, and you really need to know these types of things to solve a problem. If you use a 5:1 ratio, you're definitely not going to kill something that's active, as you can see here. Obviously, too, if you're dealing with rot, a lot of times you're going to replace the wood. So I'm not trying to tell you that BoraCare is always the solution, but I did want to let you know that it is on the label and it can be treated with this product. I wanted to just quickly show you table C on the BoraCare label. Again, it talks about the parts of water to parts of BoraCare on here. It's indicating 1 gallon to 1 gallon or 2 gallons of water to 1 gallon of BoraCare, so on and so forth. But this shows you the finished dilution percentage. So like basically you can see on a 1-to-1 scenario, you got a 23% finished dilution. Whereas if you go 5-to-1, you've got a 9% finished dilution. These types of things are going to be important for you to know to explain to your customers and also for your service tickets after you're done with the service. Wanted to go over a little bit about the basements and crawl spaces on the label. I think this is a very important one for us to talk about because it's part of our course. So basements and crawl spaces are going to be treated as following. You're going to apply 1 coat of diluted BoraCare solution to the point of the surface to saturation to all accessible surfaces, including sill plates, subfloors, floor joists, and any wood exposed to vertical access on the ground. On any wood where access is limited to 1 or 2 sides of the wood members, such as sills and plates on the foundation walls, you're going to apply 2 coats of BoraCare solution. So you're going to need to allow the first application to dry by waiting at least 20 minutes between applications. 1 gallon of solution will treat about 200 square feet of floor area, which is going to be like the subfloor, floor joist, header, and sill plates. So there's a lot of information in this section on the label. So keep in mind, a lot of times you can only get to 1 or 2 sides of wood. I mean, especially on a subfloor or something like that. The floor joists themselves, you may be able to get to 3 sides, so that may be a little easier. Sill plates, again, you're only going to be able to get to 1 side. Most people don't want to have to go through a second application on those, but I let everybody know for the product to work effectively, you're going to have to follow the label, and it does require a second application, so it's a little bit more work, but at the end of the day, we need to get the intended result, and we need to follow what the label says. As part of our training, we've obviously been talking about 3 things. We've been talking about termite control, pest control, and moisture control. So it's good to know that our product BoraCare we're talking about here also has some insects on the label. It has several different types of ants. Actually, the only ants it's not labeled for are fire, harvester, and pharaoh ants. So this can be very effective on ants. It can also be effective on silverfish, earwigs, box elder bugs, millipedes, and cricket infestations when they come in direct contact with the areas treated. So that's a pretty broad label when you think about pest control in the crawl space. One of the things in the crawl space too is the fact that it's really hard to do pest control if you think about trying to do a crack and crevice or just spraying certain areas. You almost need a whole space area type of treatment. I also wanted to let you know this product can be applicated right onto the block foundation walls as well. So it's going to be important in pest control that you actually can use the BoraCare, and then you're still getting the effect on the wood, and you're still getting the effect on any moisture related issues. Even termites is on the label. So I wouldn't suggest using this as your go-to termiticide, but keeping in mind that it can be a good preventative, it's a real good idea to use this as kind of a 3-pronged product. So when you're doing this with the pest control, you're going to apply about 1 gallon of BoraCare solution per 400 square feet of surface area. And again, there's more on the label about that, so always follow the label. But I just wanted to let you know, BoraCare just has so many uses, and here's another one that can help out with the pest control side of issues we find in the crawl space. Let's take a look at our final section, section 4, which is going to be common insects in crawl spaces. It's going to be important for you to know the common insects that inhabit crawl spaces. There's going to be a short list of occasional invaders such as millipedes, earwigs, centipedes, crickets, things like that. This is definitely not a comprehensive list, but you can imagine any insect that really likes moisture is definitely going to be drawn to a crawl space. Plus it gives them a little bit of shelter, and it also gives them protection from the outdoor habitat. You'll definitely need to be prepared to come across things like poisonous spiders such as black widows and brown recluse. Of course, you're going to see cellar and cobweb spiders, pretty common ones, but I can tell you firsthand, if you've never come face to face with a black widow in a crawl space, you definitely don't want to, because it's not a good sight. I've done it myself. Also, brown recluse, depending on what part of the country you're in, are pretty common in crawl spaces. Many times in the southeast, I've removed a vapor barrier and had brown recluse crawl right out from underneath. I've also seen many types of ants in crawl spaces, including carpenter ants. So again, depending on the part of the country you're in, carpenter ants can be a big problem in a crawl space because they can inhibit the wood just like they would outside or up in the structural members of the home. Looking a little more into general pest control in crawl spaces, this is obviously another issue we're going to need to resolve. As you can imagine, carrying a pump or a backpack sprayer into the crawl space isn't necessarily practical. We talked about that earlier with our BoraCare type of treatments, how you really need a rig-mounted sprayer with a hose or even a portable one you can leave outside. But if you've ever tried to carry a backpack into a crawl space, it's really back-breaking. It's just going to hurt your knees and everything else. It's just really not a practical solution. Once you've determined what types of insects are in the crawl space, you need to look at different types of products such as food-based granular baits and maybe even dust formulations. I know there could be some concern with dust kind of getting up into the ventilation system, so be careful with these types of products. Sometimes people dust things like sill plates and areas like that, maybe closer to the crawl space vents. We mentioned earlier that BoraCare can be a great product for insects in the crawl space as well. Definitely something you might want to look into. And keep in mind, you're always going to need to follow the product labels. So anytime you look at doing something in a crawl space, look at the label of the product. Make sure of what the precautions are so you don't get yourself and the homeowner in a bad situation. Another technique we want to talk about in controlling insects in crawl spaces is using exclusion techniques. As you can imagine, integrated pest management doesn't stop at the inside and the outside of the home. We definitely want to do things to the crawl space itself to make sure the insects can't get in. One thing you're going to see all the way on the left here is a picture of a crawl space foundation vent with a good screen in it. It's very important that you have a good screen in there. How many insects can you imagine you would keep out just by having a good screen on the foundation vents? In the middle picture, you see a crawl space where the foundation door is fallen in. This is a huge problem. I can't tell you how many times I've come across crawl spaces where the doors have completely fallen in and it's just open to the outside. On the right, you can actually see a newly installed crawl space door. That's what you want. You really want that area to be sealed up well, because it's a lot easier to keep insects out than it is to deal with them after they've already gotten in. In conclusion, you need to remember there are three main issues related to pest control in crawl spaces. The issues revolve around general insects, termites, and moisture-related concerns. A good inspection is the first step in understanding what issues need to be resolved. Next, you need to develop a treatment plan that addresses the root cause of the insect, termite, or moisture issue. Your treatment plans can involve techniques like exclusion, vapor barriers, and treating with insecticides. Always use caution when navigating crawl spaces, and always remember to follow all labels when applicating with pesticides. Congratulations, you've completed the course. You are now ready to take the quiz and receive your credit.